Welcome back, Fertility Ain't Fair community. It's your host, Britt, and I am coming back off of a vacation and our annual summer vacation up to the vineyard. And while I am feeling rested and so blessed, full of gratitude to be able to have done that, I came back with a slight sinus infection. So if I sound a little bit nasally, it's because I am, but I did not want to delay this episode because today's guest is, in one word, transformative. And she is really going to leave you with some things to think about, and hopefully some tools and takeaways to help you navigate grief. Grief is complex. And for me, grief in terms of fertility has added additional layers that I didn't even know were possible. And so when I reached out to Kristen to talk about grief through her lens and through her experience and her expertise, I really was reaching out to her not only as a guest, but as a friend and someone who I trusted in talking about this very complex situation, and also to help me out. I didn't know I was dealing with grief with infertility for a while. It took me a while to wrap my brain around, okay, that's what that was. Because in the moments, I didn't recognize it as grief. And so I hope that we all learn a lot today. We take some notes, we do some reflection. And I hope that you too will be touched by Kristen Crockett and her knowledge and just her approach to things, because she really is a transformational coach. And so I'm just happy to have her here. So let's jump on in to Fertility Ain't Fair with our guest, Kristen Crockett. So Kristen, I'm so glad you're here. And I think I first need to tell you that I'm not sure if I told you the story, but after we talked one day, it was probably via text or it might have been a phone call, but it was shortly after you started your podcast. We had a conversation. And after talking to you, I literally ordered my mics from Amazon. And I was like, I'm going to start this podcast this week. It was that simple. Because your point was, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it needs to get done. And that was it. It was like the last little push that I needed to stop procrastinating, stop giving excuses, and just open myself up to this whole thing. So I love you for that, and for many other reasons. But you've pushed me into things and away from things for several years now, always with my best interest in mind. So I just want to tell you that real quick. So I don't know if you knew that you are the final catalyst to Fertility Ain't Fair. So welcome to the show.
I love that. I love it, Brittany. That makes me so happy. So I'm so happy to be a part of anything that you are doing.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, I'll also just say this. So anyone who I know that has crossed paths with you or interacted with you, including myself, they leave changed. And it could be subtle or life altering, but you really have the unique ability to reach people on an intimate level that leaves them different than before they met you. And that's what I call the Kristen experience. Because if I had to summarize up, my relationship with you, knowing you really has been an experience of a lifetime. And I know many others would also agree. And so to have you now 100% dedicated to walking and working in your purpose of transformation is a gift that so many more can now enjoy. And so I'm just elated to have you here, and for our community to experience Kristen Crockett. So before we jump into our topic of grief, for today's show, I always start the show by asking the guest, how do you define yourself? What are the words or phrases that describe who you are?
So first of all, thank you Like, I have to pause and say thank you so much for that. That is, whew, okay, you made my week. I define myself as a transformational coach and speaker. So, really, what I do is I help people and teams align their strengths, manifest their goals, and transform personally and professionally. That's really what I do. And it's helping people take a look at the stuff that they didn't even know was there, that
Mm-hmm.
could come from their past experiences, their emotions, work experiences, childhood, all the stuff that we just don't know that we're walking around with, that
Mm-hmm.
in order to really excel, we have to really recognize it and then transform it into positivity and moving forward and let go of what no longer serves us.
I love it. And so we met on a professional basis, but it turned into personal. And so I feel like, you have been one of my spiritual guiders for the last several years, quite honestly. And um, I look at kind of what you've done so far, and you've made it a point to be very intentional in talking about grief. And so I guess, what made you want to dive into grief as an entire topic in terms of life transformations and really work with people on it one on one?
Yeah, so that's a great question. For me, it all started with my work with emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence really, I know we hear that word all the time, but it's really just understanding your emotions and understanding how you impact other people, how the
Hmm.
experiences have impacted you and created who you are. And through that work, what I started finding is that people in the professional world were dealing with a lot of grief,
Hmm.
and it was stuff that they just didn't even know that was there. So it started off with, sometimes it's like the death of what you thought was going to occur in your life,
Mm-hmm.
dashed expectations. You thought you'd be in a certain place, you thought you'd be married, you thought, all of this. And there's a whole lot of grief that comes with that. And that grief, attaches to us, and it really does prevent us from excelling. And that's really how it started. Is I started working with people professionally and realizing that their personal lives were colliding with their professional work and their goals and their mindset and all of that. So that's how it started. But then it also led me to coaching, where I started finding people who had, miscarriages that they
Hmm.
never talked about. And
Hmm.
yet they would find themselves in a room with me where they're like crying and kind of sharing things, or a parent that was lost to them, or a friendship. We never talk about the grief associated with
Right.
friendship, with friendships that we have to
Hmm.
let go, or that people no longer talk to us. So there's a lot of grief and loss in what we do. Also with COVID, it's losing jobs or losing people. And I don't think as a society we ever truly deal with grief and loss in the way that we should.
There's a lot there. And I want to go back to grief in a lot of forms. Before I go there, I want to just quickly give, the definition of the word grief. And so, according to Google, it's a noun. It means deep sorrow. It could also mean trouble or annoyance. Wikipedia defines grief as the response to loss, the loss of someone or some living thing that has died, specifically to which a bond or affection was formed. But there's a lot more to it than just those things. So, how do you define grief, either formally or informally?
To me, grief is about the expectations, the emotions, the love, all of that we have no place else, like it has no place else to go now.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's been some kind of loss, and that's really what I look at. It can be very deep, it's very different for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
It is very, personal, it's individual, but it also can be very collective and healing as well. So
Mm-hmm.
that's how I define it.
And so, what I wanted to go back to was that I think a lot of people, including myself, I really looked at grief as just the loss of a loved one, a physical loss, for so long. For most
Yeah.
of my life, that's how I defined grief. I reserved that space for a physical loss. And then when I began to grieve my fertility and my motherhood journey, I didn't think it was grief. Like, I was like, how dare I, think that's grief? And I was like, what am I feeling? And I finally got to the point where I was able to acknowledge in those moments and still, like, that's what that was, or that's what that currently is. But it wasn't instant. I didn't instantly connect that. But you mentioned, grief can be the loss of anything, a business,
Yes.
an idea, a relationship, an expectation. And that for me was what it was. It was the expectation of, believing that I would, easily get pregnant, or that I would within X amount of years start a family, or that, I didn't have any foreseen complications that would, change that vision. And so, once that vision and that path was completely altered, I didn't know what to do with those feelings. But looking back on it, it's like I was grieving the expectation and the vision and the thought of what I believed my journey to motherhood would look like.
Yes,
But that was
absolutely.
a big transition.
Yeah, and it always is. I think that traditionally we have always, like you said, I don't think that you're any different from most people of equating grief with death. And I definitely think it's more accurate to say it's equated with a loss,
Hmm.
and a loss of what we thought would be.
Hmm.
And so we have people that, I talked to one woman who's a client that she really thought that she was going to retire at this particular company, and then she
Hmm.
was laid off. So that can have a deep, profound impact on you, because you're really in your life, and you're in, like, in your head, you're
Right.
planning your life,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
you're thinking, this is going to happen, I'm going to do this, and then, when I retire, and then when that doesn't come true, it really is, it kind of can hit you in the gut. And I think of
Absolutely.
that, yeah, I think of that as like grief. There's definitely surprise grief, and then there is the grief that, for example, somebody that, like when you know that you're going to get laid off, or
Hmm.
you know that someone is dying, or they have an illness, or things like that. There's such a difference between the surprise and then the one that you kind of know is happening, and those can show up in different ways for different people.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think sometimes we kind of lump it all together, but there's, as you mentioned, various, I think, layers and sections of grief, and they're all valid, but they also are all different, and they
Yes.
may show up differently. And so I'll go there for a minute. So how are the ways that grief can show up? Obviously, it's different for all people, but as I mentioned, I was someone who wasn't able to identify something as grief until I was. But not everyone gets to that place, where they can either accept it or identify it. So, how can grief show up in different situations of people?
Grief can definitely show up as sadness. It can morph into depression. It can show up as people who their behavior changes. They become
Hmm.
withdrawn, or they are busying themselves with all kinds of things because they're not ready to deal with it. It can
Hmm.
show up as happiness, where people are just super, super happy all of the time because they may not want to deal with it, right? So
Hmm.
it shows up so differently. There are some people who will grieve a week later, a month later. Some people, it takes them 5, 10, 20 years. And some people honestly never grieve. So
Hmm.
what it looks like is very different for each person, each circumstance, each situation. And it's important for all of us to know that, because we tend to think that we should grieve the same as
Hmm.
everybody else.
Right.
And there are even some people who just associate like the loss or death of something as a part of life. And therefore they incorporate that into their worldview. So losing a person for them, even if it's their father or their mother or you know, someone really close, they look at it as a concept of, well, this is a part of life, so it's not as sad as someone else, or they're not grieving the same way that someone else does grieve. So that's the most important thing for anyone listening here, is for us to really understand that we all grieve in very vastly different ways, and we have to really be compassionate with ourselves. And then when we're compassionate with ourselves, we can then be more compassionate with others, because we all know, like, there's a certain way we expect people to behave.
Right.
And it's like weddings and funerals, those things, that behavior just doesn't
Right.
always go that way. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, people say, well, why aren't you crying? Or why, I think about those times when there has been a loss or a death, right, in the family. And so you look at someone and say, well, they haven't cried yet, or, they don't look sad, and it's like, not for us to put on them what we think it should look like or feel like. Um, and that's with anything, right? Even if you're dealing with infertility and loss of pregnancy or anything, it's not for anyone else to judge and say, well, why aren't you doing it this way? That's
Yeah.
not your place, right?
It really, it can't be. And I can't
Yeah.
tell you, like, so many people have come to me and said, well, this, you know, my aunt was doing this, or my brother was doing this, or this person's spouse was doing this. Like, you just don't know how it hits. And I will say this, like,
Mhm.
you know, there's also, like, when you lose a parent, it is one of the most difficult things, but that's
Mhm.
vastly different from losing two parents.
Right.
That's even different from losing a spouse or a child or a sibling or a cousin,
Mhm.
or a best friend who you've talked to every single day. Like, all of those different components are very, very different. And it
Mhm.
also depends on what that person was going through on top of that, right? Did they lose a
Right.
job? Are they having trouble, you know, conceiving? Are they going through a divorce? Like, all these things can really change and shift the way that we grieve and the way that we feel when we experience a loss.
Yeah. And I think also, so would you say if there's a difference between grieving and mourning, or are they kind of one and the same?
I think that they can be different. I think culturally they can be different, because I think certain cultures like, they build in a mourning process for people,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And that's different cultures around the world. But I think that how you mourn and how you grieve can also be individual. But the
Mhm.
one thing I would like us to do a little bit more of is to mourn and grieve collectively. I think in the United States, we have gotten away from that. We've gotten away from the way that ancient, you know, and I'm not even going to say ancient. I'm going to say some of us are disconnected from our ancestors, right? So
Mhm.
whether that's through slavery or immigration or just moving, you know, like,
Yeah.
it's we can be disconnected from those rituals that were created to help people actually collectively grieve. And I think that that's important, which is why I do sessions on grief and loss and invite people to them, because I think it's so important for us to gather different perspectives and to understand that, you know, we don't need to judge ourselves for grieving,
Mhm.
for mourning.
Right. Right.
Like, we don't need to judge others. We just need to understand that it is what it is, and we're going to have our own personal process with it. But it helps when you hear other people go through it. And I will tell you, when I lost my
Mhm.
father, it's the 10th anniversary of my dad's death this year. But one of the most
Mm.
helpful things for me was for people who had lost their fathers to call me and talk about their experience.
Mm. Yeah.
So that is something that I started doing for other people, was, you know, after 2, 3 weeks, to send them a list of the things that they may experience, and that it's okay, because I wish someone had done that for me.
Right. That's a really good point, and also a helpful, I think, tip. Like you said, people don't know what to do sometimes, and they don't know how to, help someone. They don't know how to be there, for people. And so that's a really good resource, I think, and tip for someone to say, hey, let me check back in, let me send you something, let me, find a way to be there for you, even if you don't ask sometimes. Um, and so I think I wanted to go back to, um, in terms of grief and mourning, I think it's funny that, jobs put in place these couple days, right, of bereavement or what have you.
Yes.
And once again, all jobs are different, but I think on a standard corporate level, jobs have in place, some days, right, for grief to happen or for, things to come together. And obviously, it's never going to be enough time.
No.
But how do you think, I guess, companies and jobs could do a better job with creating a space that actually allows people to, have more time or, you know, can I use that time in a year, right? Like, do I have to use these days right because of the funeral? Or like, could I take that bereavement time a year from now, 2 years from now, when I'm actually maybe in the throes of it? Like, how would you suggest companies do a better job with dealing with these types of situations?
Well, what's interesting is I, you know, the last company that I went to, the very first week that I started, it was someone lost their 5-year-old child.
Mm,
And I felt like they did a really great job of actually reaching out to that particular person. And first off, said, you take as much time as you need.
hmm
Second was, in addition to that, it was, how do you want to communicate this? Like,
hmm
what do you want people to say? What do you want people not to say? What are the things you want them to stay away from asking you about? And I think that that's a really great thing just as a manager. I think sometimes we talk about companies and organizations, but really it's about the individuals. It's about the
Right.
individuals who are the employees, the managers, those individuals. What is it that we are going to do to be more compassionate about, or to the people that are experiencing this loss? I will tell you a very
hmm
simple thing, because I also lost a coworker, one of the ones that I
hmm
was like, that was the one that I was the closest to.
hmm
And I will tell you, Brittany, that honestly, for the first 24 hours, I sat on the couch and just, it felt like it wasn't even real to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at the same time, I had people who came and like canceled meetings. They just took everything off my schedule. But I also had people who were still calling and asking me for things. And
hmm
so it's like, we have to really be much more compassionate about what we are like. Does it really, like, do you really need this
Right.
document right
Right.
now? Do you
Right.
need it this week? Like, what if we could wait and give people some time, right?
hmm hmm
um what if we could take things off their calendar? But the other thing too is not necessarily like always including that person, because there are some people who really need to work. Like,
Sure.
they it's like how they feel busy. It's how they
hmm
feel like that might be their grief process of,
hmm
just having to work, or needing to stay busy so that they don't sit in their sadness. And so I think
Right.
it's so individual, and I think it's so important for us to ask and to communicate. But then sometimes it's like, you have to maybe even have these conversations ahead of time, right?
That's what I was just thinking. Like, I like ahead of time, I don't know if it's when you first start or if it's part of onboarding or what it is, but like we ask people a lot, how do you want to communicate success or acknowledgement or recognition? But do we ask them, how do you want to communicate or handle a loss or a grieving process or etc. Like, how do you want to handle the bad shit? Like,
Exactly, right? Exactly, because like we're so different. Like, if you ask me, what could I do for you that would be
mhm,
really great for you if you've experienced a loss? What I say is probably going to be different from what you say, right?
right.
And so
Yeah.
we always think about empathy as jumping into somebody else's shoes, but sometimes we can't do that. We just need to ask. And And so I find that a lot too when someone has passed away, and we always like, we do the same things. We send them cards.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Flowers.
yeah, let me know. Is there anything I could
Yeah.
do for you? Just
Food.
let me
Right.
know. Right. And it's just like
Mm-hmm.
the reality is that some people have no freaking clue where to begin. They
Yeah.
just like, they're so lost that they don't
Mm-hmm.
even know where to begin to ask. And a lot of
Mm-hmm.
times, too, what I'm finding is that there's so many people that have, that's who I work with. My people who want to do it all the time, like that, like
Mm-hmm.
meaning they're independent. They want to do everything on their own. And then when you grow up that way and you really need some compassion, it's hard to then ask for it. It's hard to know
Right.
where to ask or how to
Mm-hmm.
ask. So
Mm-hmm.
we have a lot going on when it deals with grief or
Right.
loss, but that's why we need to
Yeah.
have these conversations.
Right. Before things happen.
Yes. Yeah.
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 That's a good point.
How would you like to be comforted? Sometimes it's a,
Mm-hmm.
it's a cup of hot tea. It is a hug. Some people
Mm-hmm.
can't stand when you hug them. I don't
Yeah.
necessarily, I love hugs, but I don't want to be touched when I'm crying. so
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
so it's like we just all are very different. Some people I look at, like when you are in a cubicle and you find out that someone has an illness or a terminal disease or someone has passed away, like even just offering people your office for a
Mm-hmm.
period of time where they can cry
Mm-hmm.
is completely compassionate.
Yeah. And I think in terms of the fertility journey, and so it's like, definitely something that I think you need to talk to your support system about. So whether it's your spouse or your partner, a parent, a best friend, and I think that comes with inviting some people along on the journey with you. And it's not always easy to do that, but I think to have those few people that know when something happens, because it's bound to happen. Whether it's bad news or a bad test or unfavorable results or an actual loss, like I said, of a pregnancy or whatever it is, that when you tell them, or when you're acting not like yourself, or when you say, hey, this happened, they'll already know, as you mentioned, how to help, right? Because it's very hard in that moment to help. And so if you talk to them ahead of time and say, hey, I think this is how I want you to help me when I have some bad news. And if I call you and say, hey, this happened, this is what I would like to happen on the other side, I think that would change so many situations and be very helpful for so many reasons. But the ahead of time is key.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
so you said something on your podcast. Shout out to the Plastic Couch, and we'll definitely, of course, plug your podcast before the end of our show. But you said something in one of your episodes regarding grief, and it made me stop. And I think I texted you about it. And I said, I need you to come on my show because this is everything. And you said grief isn't linear.
No.
Whew.
Yeah.
That was that gut punch. Like that hit me so heavy. Because one, it's a powerful sentence and statement. Two, because I felt like I was in a space where I had gotten past acknowledging, okay, this is what grief has looked like in the past. This is how I feel about it now. But then I had to realize that grief can be continuous.
Yes.
And just because you deal with it for one situation doesn't mean it's over.
Right.
And it sounds so simple when I say it out loud, but it was one more of those steps along this journey that changed my whole perspective, because I was like, I know how it's showing up for me. I know how I feel about it. I know what it looks like, what it feels like. But why the hell is it happening every single month? And I had to realize that
Yes.
every time your period comes, you grieve again. Every time you get that phone call that, we need to skip this month because of whatever, or the blood test came back, it's not favorable. Like every single time you hit a stop to what you think is going to be, you know, hey, it's this time, right? We got our hope back up. We're faithful. We're on the journey. We're going, moving forward. But every single time it comes back a no, you grieve again. And that shit was hard. So I just wanted you to talk us through kind of that statement and what that means to you and why you said that and how you came to that realization.
Yeah, I think that, you know, thoughts and emotions are never fully buried, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so they can pop up and they can be just as fresh as,
Mm-hmm.
you know, as it was a year ago, as it was 2 seconds ago, as it was, you know, the day before. And so I really think that it's important for us to, again, be compassionate with ourselves to know that, like, even for me, let me talk about my own experience with my dad. Like last year, like around his birthday, I was crying for 3 days and
Mm.
had no idea why. Like I had no idea why.
Mm.
And there are just times where it can pop up. It was, you know, 10th anniversary is a long time. It's a
Yeah.
long time to be without your father, you know?
Mm.
And I think what happens is that we tend to think that you grieve, you get over it, and you're good. And
Right.
that is not how grief works. It is, you could have done the work, whether you're in therapy or coaching, whatever, you could have done the work. And then all of a sudden, 3 months pass, something else occurs, you have a memory, it takes you back to that very moment, the day
Mm-hmm.
that you lost that thing, that person, that experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we just have to know that each year of grief looks different than the year before.
Yeah.
You could go through 3 years and be, you know, like, oh, this is great, I'm incorporating celebrations, you know,
Mm-hmm.
memories, and then all of a sudden you could hit a point where it's, you know, you're crumbling in tears. And so I think that it's important to know that that's day by day, that's week by week, that is year by year. It's really just like, you just have to take each day with what
Mm-hmm.
you have. Take each day, and if you have a great day, fabulous. But sometimes you could have a great hour and then
Right. Right.
have a
So
crying
some of
moment the
that,
next
get
one.
that hour celebration for that hour.
Exactly. And I think that it also just so depends on what else is going on in our life. And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, or is there support? Like our, you know, significant others or friends or family, are they being supportive? Right. Because that
Mm-hmm.
also um can, you know, that can add to it. It's also like you have some people that are like, come on now, this was 30
Mm-hmm.
years ago, this was 20 years ago, like,
Right.
why are you
Right.
still harping on this?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it's just so important for us to allow people to feel their feelings.
Mm-hmm.
um there are, you know, the same thing happens with change. We have stages of change, but you will sometimes you can go from the first to the second to the third and then go back to the first, right?
Yeah.
You're okay with a new manager, you love them, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, I'm missing my last manager, right? It's
Right.
it's so important for us to know that it is nonlinear and we cannot expect ourselves to get over something. It is moving through it,
Mm-hmm.
and moving through it just might reveal itself that we have different emotions popping up here and there, when we least expect it.
Mm. That's it. Because I guess it just, you know, I think the way you explain it is just so important. And as you mentioned, it's getting through and not over or around. You know,
Yeah.
it's through, and that makes a difference on how I think you approach things and how you will eventually get through it. Because I think if we keep looking at things as if you have to get over it, that for me doesn't leave the space that I need to deal with it. I feel like through gives me the space and the time I need to, you know, gradually cope and deal and heal. But over it, that for me doesn't work anymore. It's like, but I think that's also one of those things we were taught, right? Get over it.
Absolutely.
you know,
Yep. Yep.
get up, you're fine, get over it. But that manifests into adult situations and adult problems. And if you don't handle those things, as we know from childhood or from adolescence, and kind of growing up in the way that we learned how to deal with things, it does fester and manifest in ways that won't allow you to move forward.
Yeah. And I want to say something too here, Brittany, that's really important for
Mm-hmm.
people to know, is that it also festers and actually stays in your body, and it comes
Yes.
out through illnesses and diseases as well. Like you can look at,
Mm-hmm.
you could give me any illness and I could tell you the emotions that are associated with that particular, with holding on to that,
Mm-hmm.
those particular emotions, and how that gets, it stays lodged in our
Yeah.
body until we actually deal with it or handle it. And I think that, so many people grow up in families and communities and workspaces where we are not allowed to feel. And we are
Mm-hmm.
told that we have to get over it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
like the way that we have socialized boys, right?
Right.
Oh, get up, shake it off, like you're
Stop being a
fine.
punk.
Stop crying like a little girl. Like
Right.
those are really unhealthy ways of being. And then what happens is it just manifests itself into, every area of our life. So I do think it's so important for us to stop, to feel, to really, you know, be okay with sometimes not being okay.
Yep.
And to know that the way that we are handling life might be different from someone else who's been through the exact same experience, but it's always different because we grew up in a different family. We grew up,
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
different, emotional tools and
Mm-hmm.
and strengths. So yeah, it's super important to know that.
And I'm glad you brought the physical portion of it because, obviously, I think a lot of us think of grief as of course, very emotional, mental, spiritual, etc. But, I was definitely going to ask you to touch on that. So I'm glad you did in terms of how it manifests physically. Because I know for myself, grief and anxiety in particular, also depression slightly for me, was beginning to manifest itself physically. And that's what scared the hell out of me.
Right.
Once I realized that all three of those things, and probably some other shit too thrown in there, was literally wreaking havoc in my body and was coming out in the form of panic attacks, anxiety attacks, physical pain. Like my body was like fatigued. I was exhausted. Like everyone gets tired, everyone gets fatigued, exhausted, but this was like it's like a chronic fatigue. um I was having a different like pains in like my body, like my bones. And it was like, I ain't done nothing this week, like I haven't even had the capacity to even work out to even feel sore. So like, what is happening? But it was all connected. And that's when
Yes.
I really, really knew I had to get professional help, because I was like, I am not going to allow these things to overtake my mind and my body. Hell no. Like,
Yeah.
I got to go.
And it's so funny, like I had a few different, people that I know that were, all high achievers, extremely independent, and kind of not taught to really talk about emotions.
Mm-hmm.
But one of their things is like they were having issues with their bladder, right, as
Mm-hmm.
they got older.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the doctors said to them, this is really like you've been holding your
Mm-hmm.
bladder so much, right?
Mm-hmm.
That basically now it is like it's tortured.
Mm.
It's like it is so accustomed to, you know, not being used
Yeah.
properly that it's kind of doing its own thing. Like it's so
Mm.
important for us to know how emotions, anxiety, all of these things really do impact our bodies, and we're not necessarily taught enough about that in this
Yeah.
particular country. But that's the thing for me, is like once I started making all these connections with, even surrounding yourself by positive people versus, being around toxic people, like
Mm-hmm.
all of that impacts us, and our thoughts, our beliefs, they are energy. And that
Yeah.
energy has to lodge itself someplace, and it will lodge itself in our body if we do
Yeah.
not, release it. So, yeah.
No, it's real. And I also, and adding to that, so it was the racing of the heart, which is always terrifying.
Yes.
And also, I started to have acid reflux.
Yeah. Yep.
Like, I was like, what the hell is going on in my throat and the heartburn? And so I was over here taking, over the counter, like, heartburn medications, and it would kind of help, but then not really. And I was like, once again, I didn't eat nothing crazy today, like,
Right.
what is it? But it was stomach acid and the anxiety mixed around, and it was coming up as that I was on Prilosec for like a little bit. But I was like, this is crazy. Like, I know it's connected. I get it, but now I really get it. And
Yeah.
this has got to be fixed.
And let me just read some of the things associated with acid reflux, right?
Mm.
Feeling irritated and frustrated about your inability to control what is happening around you.
Yeah, check. Check, check, check.
Guilt about the past, feeling
Mm.
helpless about past choices, resisting life rather than learning from your experiences, feeling uncomfortable with what you're seeing, feeling, hearing, and experiencing, difficulty digesting life. Those are some common things that are associated with acid reflux. It doesn't mean that you have to have all of them, but it's
I had a
so,
few.
yeah, it's so important for people to start realizing that our illnesses and what we're doing to our bodies are completely related to emotions.
Mm. Oh, that's a lot. Yeah, but it is. Oh my
Yeah.
God. Yeah. Yeah. Yes to a lot of those things. So and trying to wrap this up, what advice do you have for those who are in a grieving season? Um, Obviously, once again, everyone is different and every situation is different, but are there some things that you would send out to people who are currently in a grieving season?
Yes, definitely. So one of the things that I want people to do is to just be comfortable with where they are right now.
Mm-hmm.
However they are grieving is okay. There are definitely affirmations that I created that are grief affirmations for
Mm-hmm.
people, just for this experience of just, talking to them about, like, for example, like being so incredibly tired. Like, grief makes you tired. Grief is heavy, right?
Exhausted. Yes.
Completely. And I think what happens is that we don't necessarily take time to just sleep. And one of the things that's really important for us is, like, sleep repairs the brain, it repairs the heart, it repairs the cells.
Mm-hmm.
It's so important to take that time. If you're tired and you're grieving, go to sleep. Go to sleep. you know
Yeah.
don't feel bad. Just really make sure that when you are grieving, whether it is your fertility, whether it is, a job, a loss of a loved one, truly it is the most important time to take care of you, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's also the hardest time to take care of you. So, allowing yourself to feel, allowing yourself to take naps, allowing yourself to be supported. When people
Mm-hmm.
ask you, start thinking of one or two things that would be helpful. Is it Uber Eats, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
actually, let me take that back. Is it sending food through a food delivery service,
Right.
right? Is it that you might need fresh flowers one day to boost you up? Is it that you might want someone to just come and sit with you? Like, what is it? What's one thing that would be helpful? Is it sending, a case of sodas or bringing over a bottle of wine? Like, what is it? Just think of that one or two things that you can actually rely on your network for. And to
Mm-hmm.
always really think about the fact that grief can be transformational. It really can. It's You're going through the fire, right? And we know that fire transforms things. And you may not always be the same on the other side, but sometimes not being the same is an incredible thing. You just have to get to that moment where you start to celebrate the great aspects of the people, the things, the experiences that you've gone through. And then also sometimes, especially if it's related to infertility, it is also, taking that time to come to terms with whatever is happening with you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really okay to scream and cry and be mad at life and everything else.
Yeah.
that, that,
Yep.
that you don't have to, just be like, oh, this is happy. No, you have a right to be angry and upset and feel how you feel in any grieving situation. And how you grieve is all okay.
I'm taking a deep, reflective breath because I thank you. I thank you for joining us today. And y'all, this is a snippet of what Kristen can do for your life. Okay. Like when she says she is a transformative, coach, that is what she was placed on this earth to do. She's been doing it for a long time, I think both formally and informally. But this is her whole business now. So you too can have the Kristen Crockett experience. So please tell us, Kristen, how people can reach you on web, social, plug your business. How can people find you elsewhere?
Sure. So definitely my website is kristencrockett.com. I am on Instagram at the Kristen Crockett, and also LinkedIn is a great place if you're interested in career transformation. All of that. I have a lot of things that I do on LinkedIn, but I am definitely, if you want to reach out for coaching, grief is always a part, or it can be a part, I should say it like that. Grief can be a part of your coaching journey, but we really work on everything. So life and career and whatever it is that you bring to the table. And we work on transforming, and it always begins with self-awareness. So Brittany, I want to thank you so much. And also a shout out to the Plastic Couch podcast. Definitely join me there. It's available on Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcast from. And you can hear more about me there. The Plastic Couch podcast is all about taking a look at the stories we are telling ourselves. We're talking about what's really keeping us from manifesting the life, career, or relationships we want. So what does the plastic represent for you? Is it anxiety, anger, shame, fear? Or is it about being trapped in other people's expectations? I'm your host, Kristen Crockett. Join me as we take a look at what's on the other side of the plastic.
So that does it for this episode of Fertility Ain't Fair. I hope you all really enjoyed our guest, Kristen Crockett. Please make sure to check her out on the web, on social. Check out her podcast, The Plastic Couch. Contact her if you need something, if you're looking for some transformation in your life, whether it's professional or personal or both. She is absolutely a resource, and I'm so glad to have been able to connect our community with Kristen Crockett. So thank y'all for listening today. As always, please check out Fertility Ain't Fair on social media at Fertility Ain't Fair on Facebook and Instagram. And make sure to check us out on our website, fertilityaintfair.com, for past podcast episodes and merch. And until next time, I am your friend in fertility. Stay hopeful.